Let's go ahead and get started. And anyone who's sort of coming in late, I'll let them in from the waiting room in just a minute. Welcome to the Meet the Author for With Justice for All. Today we've got Jack Trammell here. He is an author, researcher, and expert on disability and social history. He teaches in the Department of and is Department Chair of Sociology, Criminal Justice, and Human Services at Mount St. Mary's University. Today, what we're going to do is Jack is going to share his screen and tell us a little bit more about With Justice for All. And then we'll have some time for some questions. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. I can call on you to ask those questions, or I can read them out for you if you prefer. But with that, what I'll do is two things. I'll pass it over to Jack, and then I'll also put the link for the book in the chat so that everyone can follow along as well. So, Jack, over to you.
Thank you. It's going to take me just a second to share screen here. Let me grab my PowerPoint and share screen. So one of the questions that I asked myself at the very beginning of this project, and that people ask me a lot now that it's done, is why this book? Why a social history of disability in America / North America? Why right now? And so just a little bit of background on that. I have always loved history and dreamed about being a history teacher, but life threw me curveballs and I became a special educator. And I was so outraged by things in the special education system that I became a disability advocate, went back to graduate school, thought I was going to study education, but got swerved into sociology, studying disability from a sociological standpoint, did a sociological dissertation, went into higher education, teaching about disability, continued to disability advocate, do ADA audits for businesses and universities. And so the whole idea of being a history teacher sort of evaporated in the reality of being in the world of disability rights and disability advocacy. And I thought at a certain point in my career, I love history so much. Why don't I treat this thing that I've devoted my life to through my love of history? And that social history training was from several stints in graduate school. And so I wondered, where is a book that tells all the stories like the ones that I encountered? I had a student in my high school classroom who slept through taking notes when I was writing on a chalkboard. And I found an old overhead projector in the back and I said, this is unusual. What is this device? And I turned the light on and started writing notes on the overhead projector. And the student who had slept all year suddenly perked up and started taking notes. Turns out that he was functionally blind and was 16 and never been tested for vision, and his parents didn't really give a hoot, and the school hadn't bothered to check him out. They just kept failing him and putting him in special ed. So all of these stories that I encountered were begging for a narrative, for a bigger scaffold to hold them together. When I talked to people, I was just in a rush to share so many things, and I thought a book is a good place to put a narrative framework together for all of these stories. I also, as a historian, realized that Americans often do things differently. And the idea of American exceptionalism is not dead in some respects. We still do a lot of things our way, in spite of the fact that other countries and other cultures may do them very differently. So I wanted to look at the disability experience in light of how America has either led or has followed, has innovated or copied. I wanted to place it in some modern, late 20th, early 21st century context. As the story went on, I also realized it was a little bit of American exceptionalism for me to talk about just the US and not Canada and Mexico. So in further editing of the book, I added more about Mexico and Canada. And even though it's called Disabilities in America, in essence, I have made it more into a story about North America, which again, in the 21st century, starts to take away some of those boundaries a little bit. My audience is a general audience. I wanted anybody who'd ever talked to me about disability to be able to pick it up and find it entertaining, even though it's researched and footnote and referenced. I also wanted it to be useful to undergraduates. I invented the disabilities coursework series at my university, and I'm not allowed to use my own textbook by an ethics standard that our university has, but all of you can if you teach undergraduates. But I also wanted it to be very accessible to undergraduates. I have undergraduates who struggle with their reading for various reasons, and I wanted it to be approachable. So that's what got me interested in the project. But what is in the book itself? It's definitely a social history text, which is my bread and butter, which means it's filled with lived experiences. And I've tried to delve into a broad range of experiences, black, white, male, female, other gendered, and so on. And I've looked at people from presidents who are quite famous and tried to dip inside their disability experience to almost anonymous institutionalized individuals who are only known by a shoebox of letters that a family member shared with me. And so it's a story about stories. And yes, being a scholar, it does have important dates, legislative events, and certain advocates and well-known people for general disability literacy. If somebody reads the book, like one of my students, I want them to be able to have an intelligent conversation about disability in America or in the global world today. And then because of my sociology background, I also really tried to pay attention to intersectionality, race, gender, and disability. There's a new field some of you have heard of called DisCrit, which brings together disability studies and critical race theory. I'm allowed to say that in this group, I think. But the intersectionality piece is fascinating to me. Martin Luther King, Dr. King said that Black vets coming back from Vietnam were twice disabled, once by their bullet wound and once by their race. And so that element is in the book as well. So a couple of quick quotes from the book to give you a flavor. And I'll just read these out loud because I think they sound better that way. There have been breakthrough moments in the disability rights movement, but there have been many other days where victory was not achieved or there were outright failures, and they were just as important. There were many days where people with disabilities attempted to live their lives without stigma and oppression and were not fully successful. The second quote is, students and scholars of disability in the 21st century will need to account for a number of complex cultural variables, even as technology and biomedical breakthroughs transform human life and notions of what it is to be normal. For starters, the brain and its evolution will be at the forefront. And just as I was coming to the end of this book project, I undertook a study of artificial intelligence and its impact on people with disabilities. And that's appears at the end of the book. But since the book has been written, I've been doing talks and writing more about that. And in case you're interested in that artificial intelligence aspect, I did include a little bit of information here. Some of what I talk about when I interact with people in the disability world is talking about classic social theory from Georg Simmel and his idea of group size, dyads, triads, and so on. And the old model of technology for people with disabilities was that they interacted directly with technology. They used the screen reader. They used the Braille print. And so it was a dyad. It was a one-to-one relationship with the technology. But artificial intelligence introduces a communication interface, which is the AI in essence. And so there's now a triad. And so the person with disabilities doesn't interact as directly with the technology. They instead interact with the interface. And this switch from a group of two to a group of three using classic social theory suggests some very interesting changes in that relationship. And so it's almost, I'm thinking these days, it's a new type of triad that's different than anything we've seen before in terms of a group dynamic. If you're wondering where I stand, everybody at my university is freaking out about AI and cheating and things like that. And I'm kind of a lone wolf, having studied AI the last couple of years. And I believe that it holds promise. For example, my 82-year-old mother can have a custom tailored personal companion that is very expensive in human form, but will be very accessible in technological form. And that will be a huge relief to me, not to have to spend hours with her every day, even though I love her very much. On the other hand, I do see the potential catastrophe where we value certain technology or AI over real human flaws. And part of the theme in this book is a celebration of being human, which means to be disabled or to experience disability yourself or through others. And so that's my latest gig that I'm working on, but it appears at the end of this text in the last chapter when I speculate about the future a little bit. So that's there's a lot of history in there. It's mostly chronological, but it also is topical. So there are lots of sidebars and there's some charts and things. Basically, I start out with colonial America, looking at both Canada, Mexico, and what would be the US eventually. And then I end up in the 21st century, but it's not intended to be completely chronological. And people have pointed out to me that I missed this person or I didn't quote that person. And I think that's inevitable with any academic project like this. But it was an attempt to make something that was very accessible and approachable and had the history, but also had these really important ideas in it that disability scholars and disability advocates realize are central to studying the disability experience. So that's the book. And I wanted to keep it fairly short so that we could interact and have time to comment. If I struck a nerve with anything that I mentioned already, or you have a question about the book, I'm happy to open it up.
Thanks, Jack. I have a question in the chat here. I might just read out and we can get things kicked off. It says, in exploring the long trajectory of disability rights, you highlight both grassroots activism and legislative milestones. What do you see as the most underappreciated act of advocacy or community organizing in that history? And why do you believe it's been overshadowed in mainstream accounts?
Well, there are many underrepresented stories. For example, I can't pull the number off the top of my head of American parents of a child with special education. They are a group of hundreds of thousands of Americans in this example who are living on the front lines of a disability experience. And yet, unless you've raised a child with special needs, what the rest of us know about that experience is very limited. And so in terms of advocacy, there there always has to be a balance between a law that is just, and generally speaking, people think the ADA has made some impact. It had to be reauthorized because the courts gutted it, but the fact that we reauthorized it and we've stuck with it, there is some energy in that, but it still remains a grassroots issue where many of the disability stories in my experience of things remain untold. They remain things that people will share in intimate conversations, but we still have a lot of writing and research and advocacy we can do around that. Another group that is forgotten are, I mentioned people who are institutionalized. When we deinstitutionalized, many of those people became forgotten. They disappeared into the landscape of a vast America, and their access to healthcare or basic needs was often sketchy at best. And their stories aren't told because they often haven't written about themselves or had a platform to deliver their own stories. And so the need to balance advocacy and legislation remains key, as well as the need to tell the stories, I would argue.
You. Does anyone else have a question? feel free to jump in if you do.
I
No
guess
need.
I'll go ahead.
Go ahead, Sasha. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jack, for doing this. I was invited like last minute by a peer, somebody I know at Gonzaga University, and I'm a PhD candidate at Gonzaga University right now and up in Washington. And I myself am a member of the disability community and was highly intrigued and so thankful that your book was in my inbox, and just like I got it yesterday, being like, oh, cool, I can sit in on this. So I haven't read it yet, okay? But I'm really looking forward to reading it. And my research right now as a PhD candidate is it's a bit different. It's post-qualitative, and I'm exploring with the starting points of disability, animacy, and advocacy, because I'm a half of a service dog team, right? And so when you talk about stories and everything like that, our service dog teams also like an underrepresented community and documentation. Like my research has kind of I've tried to find stories or research, not just the United States, but elsewhere, right? At least in English on that. And is it in your experience also that that is a community that is not as documented as well, or not? I don't know if that
That
makes any sense. Thank you.
that is absolutely the case. And when I wanted to write in my book about um, service animals and um, partnerships, the literature I had to draw on was pretty scant. And there are organizations that advocate. I'm on the board of one, and they post history of when service animals were introduced for military use and different things like that. And so you will find in the book that there's some of that basic information, but you won't find me citing deeper research into that because I didn't find much of it. And I think that that's a huge area where we need to do more. The board that I serve on is a nonprofit called Possible, and they attempt to match people looking for a service animal with a service animal. And it's sort of like dating for service. And we have successfully matched a few young people of school age with a service animal and paid for the training of the service animal. But that's work that's unknown to most people, and the fact that it has to be done on a grassroots level rather than on a vaster scale, and that we don't have national guidelines, as far as I know, for training, is all an area where the legislation and the advocacy, but also telling the stories, all of those are important.
All right, thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
I can see in the chat that Professor Kaiser, you've said something about the South African context. Did you want to tell us a little bit about this? You've said I think we have the same problems in South Africa.
Yes, there's limited amount of schools that basically help children with disability within South Africa. And even if you go to the work environment, there's limited law also on it. The Constitution protects people with disability in the Employment Equity Act, but still you find that only a limited amount of people with disability get work within the work environment.
Yes, that remains a stunning problem in the US, where some regions, people with disabilities, the unemployment rate is as high as 75%, which is a shocking number. And when you control for college education and socioeconomic status, they still are vastly more underemployed than they should be, given the statistics that we have for employment. This is in part because our workplaces are still not designed for people with disabilities. Universal design principles are slowly creeping into some companies, like the Ford Motor Company is one that has embraced this and has hired a lot of people with disabilities, but also has designed their workspace. On the other hand, a company like Microsoft, I've tried to work with a branch of Microsoft, and the culture there was completely different than at Ford Motor Company. And so the other thing is that South Africa may or may not be like the US, but in the US, there are many employees that employers who won't do the right thing unless they're kind of nudged or pushed, or even sometimes threatened with legal action. And so part of what happened in the US was employers ignored the legislation like the ADA or Section 504. And depending on who's in office and who's in charge at the Office of Civil Rights, you may or may not ever have any trouble over it. And the employee has to go and sue the employer, which is a huge disincentive to create a workspace environment that's friendly for people with disabilities. And so, in spite of the fact that I would say in 2025, the American workplace is better in terms of readiness and accessibility for people with disabilities, there still are some disincentives for employers to really go all out. If they perceive there would be extra cost, or there would be cutting into the profit margin or anything like that. Would you say that there's something similar like in South Africa?
It sounds similar, but now we did have a new updated act on the Employment Equity Act, where they're basically going to specifically look at the number of disability people that you employed. So if you don't reach your target, then you're going to have huge fines. So I think that is going to be, good for the people with disabilities. But even, people that get with disabilities, if they go to a school that you just find somewhere in the country, then basically they stay and later on work at the schools up to the age of 25 years. And thereafter, the people just disappear and go back to the families because they can't get any jobs.
That's another group with untold stories, are the families that support adults with disabilities. I have a 5-year-old granddaughter with profound developmental disabilities, and she's likely to need to live at home even after she finishes school, which she's probably going to be able to do at the age of 18, thanks to special education and thanks to a mom who's really got her act together, and a grandma who is taking care of the child part of the time. But that my granddaughter will probably have to live at home after she graduates. And the story of families who accept that as a day-to-day normal routine and embrace the extra work involved, and try to be patient with the rest of the world that doesn't understand how that's going, that's another untold story. But I also find in schools and workplaces, and you were partially alluding to this, at my previous place of employment, we had horrible sidewalks, and I said, we need to fix this. And somebody on the business side of things said, well, we don't have any students who use wheelchairs right now, so we're not going to worry about it. And that, to me, is sort of an example of how somebody who doesn't consider themselves a bad person, who discriminates against people with disabilities, looks at it through what they think is a practical lens, but which actually betrays some of those attitudes that the disability rights movement has been trying to fight against for so long.
Ibtial, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name. I believe you had a comment or a question in the chat. Are you able to unmute? I can see you've said, can we say there is a kind of disability called emotional disability? And if yes, how can we define it? Did you want to elaborate on that?
Yes.
Yes. Hi. This is Ibtal from Egypt, and I have read an MA thesis dissertation in literary studies that talk about emotional disability, and I wonder if there is anything called emotional disability and how can we define it?
Yes, there is something that's called emotional disability. In special education in the United States, that used to be used as a generic category for including children with various kinds of behavioral problems, or diagnosed with chronic depression, bipolar disorder. Since that time, that term has become a little bit less used because it's so generic. And the American Psychological Association regularly tries to publish what they claim is the sort of Bible for diagnosing various kinds of emotional disabilities or psychological disabilities. And so bipolar disorder, for example, now is a diagnosis that a teenager can potentially get rather than being generically called emotionally disabled. But that label was used quite a bit in special education to get help to students before there was a way to really give them a kind of label that was more meaningful. In general disability culture, emotional disability has also become less prevalent in its use language-wise as we have developed in our culture greater ability to talk about things, like we see ads for specific disorders on TV. Like if you have ADHD, this is the medication that will make your life rainbows and smiles. And so that generic language of emotional disability has served very usefully to get things going. But as we've evolved, it's become more of a generic term that people might throw a whole bunch of different types of disabilities under, but that schools, for example, find less useful now that we have more sophisticated ways of diagnosing young people. And I would say in the adult version of the world, it's the same way. It's become more specialized, and that term is more generic.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great question.
Rebecca, I think you had a question as well.
Yes, thank you. So one of the things in the United States that fascinates me about disability is the way that the language around disability and the stereotypes from those language tend to come to the model of the medical model or the biomedical model of disability versus the social model, which is, I think, what we're trying to move toward with the civil rights movement. Can you speak to that a little bit about the sort of the tension between those two models in the US?
Yes, and I see what you mean. Oh, wait a second. I just used ableist language. I implied that if you can't see it, you can't understand it. The English language, and in particular, American English, which varies from some other forms of English spoken around the world, but American English in particular is laden with ableist language, and it makes for an entertaining 15-minute presentation to show how many ways that's embedded. And yet the problem is really deeper than that. It's language is spawned by social norms, and unless social norms change, then the language doesn't change. And so in some cases we have tried to change people's behavior by saying, well, don't call them a disabled person, call them a person with a disability, person first language. And while I admire those efforts, they don't attack the root problem, which is that we have a medicalized view of disability. And the social model, of course, attempts to understand disability as being created by these social norms, being socially constructed. And my dissertation was all about that. And so I think we come back to the issue of the power of the medical model is that we value living to our 80s instead of dying when we're 30 or 40, like we did 100 years ago. We have entrusted the medical profession and the medical institution with tremendous power over a person's, just the fact that you would have to go to an expert to get a specific diagnosis, to get a certain kind of social security, means that the label has become the thing that gets you access to resources or accommodations. And while there may be a legal reason for that, the social consequences for that are that we further embed the medicalization of disability. And so I do discuss this in the book, and I acknowledge the power of medicalization at the same time that I acknowledge that having a cure for this or a treatment for AIDS or a cure for this type of cancer, it's common sense that we want those things and we want to, promote finding those things. But we also need to acknowledge and find a way to move away from that medicalization, which is pretty extreme compared to other times in human history where that has not been what defined people's identity primarily.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Great question.
I have another question in the chats, just asking, I would be interested in hearing Jack speak more about the dynamic relationship between disability, identity, and AI. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Jack?
Yes. People with disabilities, we were talking about work. AI is providing work opportunities for people with disabilities to work from home and with technological accommodation. And 45% of all the new jobs this year in the Mid-Atlantic region where I work are involving working side by side with or in tandem with artificial intelligence. And so the AI conversation for me about people with disabilities is opportunity and warning. There is great opportunity for leveling the playing field. Telemedicine for people who can't access public transportation is a great thing, but also, can you get the same level of care through telemedicine that you can by being there in person with the doctor? And so for me, AI is showing how sharp the double edge of the sword with technology can be. And AI is going to push us and challenge us with those ethical questions. We will be in a situation where just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do something. And it's going to present a lot of things that may appear to be wonderful opportunities for people with disabilities, but may also be embedded in things like medicalization and a rejection of disability identity and a counter to some of the ideas in the disability rights movement. And so for me, AI is fascinating. It's not as scary to me as it once was. I don't think it's going to take over the world, but it is a double-edged sword. And people with disabilities in the disability rights movement and their advocates have fought for their identity to say, I'm perfectly human how I am, and I don't need to be different to be human. And now there's suddenly going to be a lot of pressure. If you can have a artificial limb that's better than an actual leg, we're going to live in a world where anyone could run faster and replace their biological legs with their mechanical legs. And it's going to raise new issues about identity, especially for people with disabilities who have fought so hard to say, I'm fine just the way I am and accept me for who I am. And AI is going to challenge that.
Sasha, I believe you had something to ask.
Yeah, and actually, I'm really glad that that was asked about AI, because just for a side note, I've been doing a lot of reading about that myself, and AI is no longer as scary to me either. I view it actually from my research as like a becoming with, because I'm that oddball that does the new materialist stuff instead of the binary, because the different models of disability are also going to be challenged, as you well know. And it already is going on, as you were stating, in relation to that. So it's really cool that was brought up. I just had a question, and it's just a general one. And I'm starting a transitional job search, going from graduate assistant for several years at the university to starting a career. And do you have any networking or just general advice that you've seen maybe that has worked for folks? It's as far as an example, here in the United States, as part of the employment application, they're like, do you have a disability? Do you want to state it and stuff? And people that I've talked to of all different diverse parts of the communities have been like, that's kind of a catch-22, it's kind of difficult to navigate that. So do you have, like, that's just an example, but do you have any networking advice or general advice about stuff like that? Because I'm a little stumped with that. I've filled out so many apps and I've gotten mixed results. A lot of times when you say I declined to state, they'll give you a call back. I've had one place where I did it once one way and they didn't call me back, and I did it for another way and they called me back, but then I didn't get the job. So
if you're applying for jobs in higher education, the first thing I'd say, and I've been in higher ed, I guess, about 25 years. My experience has been that it's its own special job market. even for staff people, not just for people applying for faculty positions, but for staff positions often as well. It's very institution specific. I have spent 7 years at Mount St. Mary's, but before that, I worked at VCU. I worked at some other places, and each one of them had such a different culture and a different landscape that I feel like anyone applying couldn't possibly know everything they need to know about what would make them an attractive candidate for the place. So I do recommend to my graduate students that they spend a little more time researching the schools they're applying for. We recently hired somebody in my department, and in his cover letter, he had mentioned several specific programs that we were running that, and then he compared them to 2 that he was running at his institution in Oklahoma. But it's also, the networking thing is important. I would like to say I got my job at the Mount because I'm awesome, but I ran for Congress in 2014 and I lost. And the dean, one of the deans at the university, emailed me and said, "Hey, now that you lost your election, are you going back to your old school, or why don't you come to our university?" And I applied. And of course, there were lots of other people who applied, but I became a finalist and I interviewed and I got offered the job. But you could argue that I wouldn't have even applied if he hadn't reached out to me and said, "Hey." And so the networking thing is really important. And finally, I'll say that the disclosure element is so difficult. I have invisible disabilities, and at one previous school, I disclosed that and got a terrible evaluation from my supervisor. And I learned at the next stop, I didn't disclose, and I got great evaluations. And so what does the basic lizard brain tell me? Don't disclose. At my current school, I have disclosed not for accommodations, but to students and colleagues, mainly because I hope that the students will feel like it's okay to disclose when they need to. But it's a double-edged sword, and I've seen people get punished for it. And you can skirt the law and get away with doing it without technically breaking the law. But I caution people when they're applying places to be honest about who you are, but also be strategic in how you're making yourself match with the company's landscape that you're applying to.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
You're welcome. And best wishes.
I have another question in the chat. I'm going to read it out. I hope that's okay. My question is about the history of bipolar as diagnosis, and if there's any emerging topics related to bipolar. Difficult to articulate what accommodations, because so many don't make sense, and it's a non-apparent visible illness. So some kind of questions around accommodations for that. Did you have anything specific to say about that, Jack?
Yes, when I was working with students more earlier in my career, college students and high school students, I accidentally, just happenstance, specialized in working with students with bipolar disorder and also students with ADHD. In terms of bipolar disorder, when I advanced into research and into higher education, I continued to study bipolar disorder. And one of the problems with bipolar disorder, just like ADHD, is that psychiatrists and doctors can't fully agree on general manifestations that show up in all people with that diagnosis. And so the solution in the past was to divide it into different types, like ADHD, ADD, combined ADHD, ADD, and those categories didn't solve that either for bipolar or for bipolar type 1, bipolar type 2. And so by looking at that effort, we can see that bipolar specifically can manifest in so many different ways that a laundry list of accommodations for bipolar would look different for almost every single person you encounter. And that is bothersome to some people who would rather have a nice world where extra time on a test or testing in a room by yourself solves everything. With a person who has bipolar disorder, it's far from simplistic. It's the opposite. And so people with bipolar, we were talking about disclosure, have a very difficult choice to make it work with the stigma that goes along with bipolar. Still, even though we see the ads on TV for medications, we see characters on TV sitcoms that have bipolar, there has been a little bit of a coming out for bipolar. Nonetheless, the complexity of how it presents differently in different people means that it's really hard for the public to not engage in stereotypes about it, and also really hard to generically talk about accommodations unless it's a specific case. Did that answer the question, or did I go astray there?
I hope so.
I can chime in.
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
So, like, one of the things I'm wondering about is, like, in the DSM, whatever the next one is, like, are they going to delineate this anymore? Because I feel like borderline, bipolar, like, severe depression and anxiety, ADHD, like, they're all, like, swimming in the same pool and, like, touching each other. But, like, right now, it feels like we all have, a lot of the bipolar people I meet have, like, touches of a lot of different things, like, happening at once. And then I find that the accommodations that, like, I ask for are like more sensory related because it helps me stabilize my mood. So like, can I be in a room with adjustable lighting or natural lighting? Can I like find a way to have quiet time in between my classes because I teach kids and like I don't want to like be too harsh, so to help me regulate my mood, or like other things, like just knowing how often I'm going to be able to eat during a day, being able to control the temperature that I have to sit in for hours at a time. Like it seems like weird stuff sometimes to request because it's so physical, but it's all me trying to regulate my mood. I don't know if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense, and it's the perfect illustration of why the one size fits all works even less with bipolar than it would with other types of disabilities. And that's a great example of how the specificity. And I also want to circle back to something you said about swimming in the same pool. There are evolutionary biologists who believe that some of these disorders are actually sort of ghosts or remnants of parts of the brain that we actually needed to survive as humans. And so we've kind of been punishing people for having parts of the brain that actually got us to survive as long as we have. And I think that that's kind of fascinating, given how we stigmatize some of these disorders or disabilities. And so that's a great example. Thank you for sharing.
We have time for another question or two if anyone would like to unmute to ask a question to Jack. I don't want to miss anyone. So we have time for another question if anyone wants to jump in. If not, I might hand it over to you, Jack. Do you have any final words or anything you wanted to add to wrap things up before we head off?
Sure. First of all, I really appreciate you listening today, because I feel like disability is something that I should talk to everyone about as often as I can. It's become the focus of my career. And so I hope that you will see this not as, yay, Jack published a book, but instead as a call to do your own advocacy and to do your own research and to give a voice to those who don't always have a voice. And that's my 2 cents worth. Thank you for coming today, though.
Perfect. Well, thank you. I've put the link to the book in the chat there. Please also know that if you are a Research Network member, you can download the PDF of the book. You just make sure you're logged in, otherwise we don't know. But you can have download the PDF of the book for free or purchase a copy there through the link that I've put in the chat. So thank you all for your time today, especially you, Jack, and it was a pleasure. And happy afternoon, morning, good evening, wherever everyone is in the world.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.